Hi, my name is Mike Fryer. I'm presenting the Hidden Treasures course, and today we're looking at session 5, which is the Holocaust, the most tragic event in history. And I want to begin by presenting you or suggesting some books which are good reading for Holocaust. And when we look at Holocaust, I don't want us to look at purely the death of 6 million Jews. We have to look at what happened after the Holocaust, which was the Jews seeing that still they have a hope in the future. So one of the books that I recommend to you is another book by Martin Gilbert called The Righteous Among the Nations, which tells the story of Christians and non-Christians who rescued Jews in the Holocaust, and also tells the story of the Jews who were rescued. So the Holocaust is just not about the death of 6 million Jews. It's about the beginning of a new life for many Jews and a hope. Another book from Holocaust is probably the world's best expert on Holocaust is Professor Yehuda Bauer from Yad Vashem, and he's written a book called A History of the Holocaust. Simple title, but there's a huge amount of information in there. And also, I forgot to mention in the last session, but a book on anti-Semitism by Dennis McShane also discusses aspects that we're going to discuss today and last week. There are also many courses that teach Holocaust. This is one that I've qualified in teaching. It's called Echoes and Reflections, and that has Holocaust testimony with it. And we can come and teach that in your area if you prefer. It's a long course, but actually it goes into great depth about the Holocaust and why it happened and who were the perpetrators and the rescuers and how it evolved. So that's a really good course. Another book I want to recommend to you as well is my own book. I was asked earlier about the replacement theology session that we did last time and regarding the feasts and the festivals, and I wrote a short book which discusses the replacements of the feasts and festivals called Craft or Christ. But the book that I always refer to, and I refer to it at every session because it's the only book really we should refer to, and that's the Bible. And we begin tonight by looking at the book of Zechariah 1 verse 8. And we see in verse 8 that Zechariah has a vision. And he says, "In the night I saw a man riding on a red horse. He was standing amongst the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses. Then I said, 'What are these, my Lord?'" Well, we know when we look at that scripture that what Zechariah is seeing is he's seeing the Messiah of Israel in the midst of the Jewish people who are in the diaspora. In the third session, we looked at the Jews who were in the diaspora, had been dispersed amongst the nations. And Zechariah is understanding from this vision that the Messiah is right in the center of those Jewish communities while they face persecution. The man on the red horse is clearly the Messiah. The myrtle trees represent the nation of Israel. And the glen, or the pit, as you may have in your translations, means the nations. So that's what Zechariah is seeing. And then if we move to verse 15 in Zechariah 1, the Lord says, "I am extremely angry with the nations that are at ease. For while I was only a little angry, they made the disaster worse." What God is saying there is that whilst the Jews were in the diaspora, whilst they're being persecuted, they were scattered by him, but the nations added to the discipline that God put to them and persecuted them beyond our imagination. God did not cause the Holocaust. It was man who caused the Holocaust. Often when we look in Holocaust studies, and I graduated in Holocaust studies at Yad Vashem, the question is asked, where was God in the Holocaust? The question which should be asked is, where was humanity in the Holocaust? Where was man? God was always there in their midst, crying out for them. And he says this in Zechariah 2 verse 8. He says, "For thus says the Lord of hosts, truly the one who touches you," and he means Israel, "touches the apple of my eye. And the nations have persecuted Israel and the Jews beyond our imagination." When we look at the persecution of the Jews, and in the last session I spoke about the church and what we'd said about the Jewish people, we had dehumanized the Jewish people. Our governments had dehumanized the Jewish people in many, many ways, but so had the church. And when we look at cases of murder, I'm a retired National Crime Squad detective, and I can say this from experience. We examine motives and we examine the thoughts of the perpetrator. And often in the mind of a perpetrator, he has come to believe that the person, the victim, is not human. In his mind, he's dehumanized the victim and therefore is able to kill them. And what happened at Holocaust was, prior to the extermination of the Jews, the murder of the Jews, the German people and the Polish people and the Austrian people had been taught that the Jews had no value. They had been dehumanized in their eyes, and therefore they were able to commit the most evil atrocities humanity has known. But the church has played a huge part in that. And I want to read some historians' references to the relationship between Holocaust and Christianity. Stephen R. Haynes, a historian, says this in his book: "Those who study the relationship between Christianity and the Holocaust have very concisely described the connection. Although Christian anti-Judaism did not by itself make the Holocaust possible, the murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis and their accomplices could not have occurred without Christianity. This means very simply that the Holocaust is a Christian event, a watershed in church history." Victoria Barnett, another historian, says of the Protestant churches, "In Nazi Germany in September 1935, there were a few Christians in the Protestant confessing church who demanded that their church take a public stand in defense of the Jews. Their efforts, however, were overruled by church leaders who wanted to avoid any conflict with the Nazi regime." She also states, moreover, and particularly in Germany, the German Evangelical Church, which was the largest Protestant church in Germany, the allegiance to the concept of Christendom was linked to a strong nationalism. And we must understand that 95% of Germany was Christian. She says throughout the 1930s there was ample evidence of anti-Semitism, as we've seen already, in many sermons and in articles that appeared in German church publications. Some church leaders proudly announced that they were anti-Semites. Others warned their colleagues of any public show of support for Jewish victims of the Nazi regime. Christian anti-Semitism often complemented other factors, notably the strong nationalism of the German Protestant churches. The most extreme example of this combination of anti-Semitism and nationalism, she says in her book, was the so-called German Christian movement, a Protestant group that embraced Nazism and tried to Nazify Christianity by suppressing the Old Testament, revising liturgics and hymns, and promoting Jesus as an Aryan hero who embraced the ideals of the new Germany. And local historian, Reverend Canon Lloyd Jones from Bangor University in Wales says this: "Since 1945, many detailed accounts have been written of anti-Jewism, Jewish polemic in Christian literature. With few exceptions, they begin with major theologians of the 2nd century, as we learnt in the last session. Spurred into action by the claim that there is a direct link between the Nazi Holocaust and church's negative attitude towards Judaism scholars, he is of the opinion that the teaching of contempt in the church caused the German people to, or enabled the German people to carry out the Holocaust." Where does it begin? Well, it begins, as we said, in the last century, or the 1st century, with Marcion and the Gentile leaders of the church who were anti-Semitic. But we see throughout history that there has been a persecution by Christians of the Jewish people. One of those elements of persecution were in the forced baptisms in Europe and in Italy. Forced baptisms were common, especially among Jewish children. The catechumens in the Vatican in 1543 were a place which were well known for forced conversions. Many conversions were conducted after a great deal of pressure being put on children, parents, and the ordinary Jewish communities of Rome. There were child baptisms, and one such example is the baptism of a 3-year-old child called Rosa in 1809. Rosa's mother, Rachel, was walking towards the market in a place called Tivoli, near Rome, and it was raining. 2 Catholic ladies offered to look after Rosa, and when the mother, Rachel, went into the market and left the child with the Catholic ladies baptized the child with the water from the puddles. And from that time on, it was said that Rosa became a Christian. She became a Catholic. And no matter how many attempts Rachel made and pleased to the Vatican to have Rosa returned, Rosa never returned. The church kept Rosa, saying she was now Christian and was now not allowed to go back to her parents, who would bring her up in a state of not having salvation. So the church saw that Rosa would now have salvation. And that was in 1809. But there were many attempts to baptize Jews by force throughout history, which caused Jews to become the scourge of Europe in many places. In August 1871, Pope Pius IX told a women's group, "Before the time of Jesus, the Jews had been children in the house of God, but all this had changed owing to their obstinacy and their failure to believe. They have become dogs. We have in Rome today too many of these dogs, and we hear them barking in all the streets and going around molesting people everywhere." I want you to imagine Pope Pius IX speaking to a large women's group in these terms. And that was in 1871. That's not that long ago in real terms. How a man of authority would influence those women who would go back and influence their families and their children. And clearly what he said was that there are too many of these dogs. What he does, he dehumanizes the Jews in the eyes of those women and also for their families. In 1880, the Jesuit biweekly Civilta Cattolica began to publish anti-Semitic doctrine. Publications were such as these. Jews were obligated by their religion to hate non-Jews, and as a consequence, Christians despised them. Societies have to protect themselves from the Jews, and governments would be well advised to introduce exceptional laws for a race that is so exceptionally and profoundly perverse. In another article, the same newspaper said, "As history has shown, if this foreign Jewish race is left too free, it immediately becomes the persecutor, oppressor, tyrant, thief, and devastator of the countries where it lives. Special laws must be introduced to keep the Jews in their place." And this is where Hitler got his ideas from. And he blamed the church, not the Nazi party. Father Oreglia, a writer in the paper, compared Jews to wolves and said they should not be set free. And these are the years just prior to the Holocaust. The end of the 19th century, the Vatican Daily Observatoire Romano said this, and this is quite shocking. "Anti-Semitism ought to be the natural, sober, thoughtful Christian reaction against Jewish predominance." The article continued, "True anti-Semitism is and can be sustained nothing other than Christianity completed and perfected in Catholicism. In the 1920s, many clergy supported the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I'll just mention those if you don't know what they are. In Russia, at the end of the 1800s, documents were produced that said that Jews in Russia were the cause of society's financial collapses, and that Jews were wanting to rule the world. And they were called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And Monsignor Yuan wrote of the protocols in the 1920s. From the triple viewpoint of race, nationality, and religion, the Jew has become the enemy of humanity. A year later, Monsignor Yuan was congratulated for his work by Cardinal Gaspari of Rome. So he was congratulating this man for his anti-Semitism. In 1920, Father Rosa said, the Jews were to blame for the Russian Revolution as they had been for the French Revolution. By the 1930s in Austria, considered to be a Catholic state, the birthplace of Hitler, anti-Semitism was a daily occurrence in Christian publications. So Hitler grew up with these publications. In 1936 in Poland, leading churchman Cardinal Lond declared that Jews were the vanguard of atheism. He encouraged the boycott of Jewish businesses and warned that the Jews were waging war against the Catholic Church. Have we heard churches today calling for boycotts of Israeli goods? On the eve of Kristallnacht, and Kristallnacht was an incident that occurred in November 1938, which was perpetrated by the German Nazi Party. It was an event where the people of Germany went out onto the streets and burned synagogues, assaulted Jews, smashed windows, and that's why we use the name Kristallnacht, because that means night of broken glass. And 300 Jews were arrested. Jewish books were burnt in the streets. The night before that event, the production Civilta Catholico published this statement: the Jewish question will remain unsolved because, as all agree, even those most kindly disposed towards the Jews, their corrupt messianism, that is, their fatal craving for worldwide financial and political domination, is the true cause that makes Judaism a font of disorders and a permanent danger for the world. I've spoken in the main about Catholic press, the Catholic Church, but I want to mention the strength of anti-Semitism in the Protestant churches in Europe. In 1835, a Protestant vicar by the name of Adolf Stoker became the chaplain to Kaiser Wilhelm. He founded one of the first anti-Semitic political parties in Germany, called the Christian Social Democratic Party. And it was part of the initiation into that party, or membership into that party, that you were anti-Semitic, and you were forced to sign a document. Well, the people of Germany actually did this voluntarily, to say that they were anti-Semitic. And the church and the Social Democratic Party of Germany grew because it was known as an anti-Semitic religious party. Now, when I mentioned about dehumanizing people, the church has clearly, prior to the Holocaust, dehumanized the Jews in their eyes, and for the people of Germany and Austria and Poland. But there were many who did a lot of work to support the Jewish communities in Europe, and there were many who became rescuers, many Christians. Sadly, there were more secular people who became rescuers rather than Christians, but many people did become rescuers. And I want to just raise something with you that may help you to understand what happened in the Holocaust and what position each individual placed himself, whether he was a perpetrator, Christian or not, whether he was a victim, which you had no choice about, whether there was whether they were persecutors or rescuers. And the first group I want to look at is the victim. In Holocaust, the victims were, of course, Jews, but they were homosexuals, gypsies, political activists, and those who were handicapped or the elderly. 70,000 people, children and old people, were murdered by the Nazi Party because they thought they were not valuable to society. But who did this? There were many people who took part as perpetrators in the Holocaust. They were ordinary German people before the war. They were men and women who were like you and I. They sat in their homes, they worked, they watched the television, or listened to the radio rather. They did normal things. They had children, they went to school, they were educated, they did many things, and suddenly the Holocaust was upon them, and they were part of the story. And we see that when we look at perpetrators, they're not only the people who wanted to be a part of the Nazi Party, they were ordinary people. One example of that is Battalion 101, when a group of volunteer policemen turned in just a few short years to become the most virulent and aggressive and violent group of murderers in Europe, just 450 of them. Before the war, they were trying to help society, and then they were murdering Jews. And that is the group we call the perpetrators. But there is another group called bystanders, and those are the ones who stood by and did nothing. They were the ones who looked upon the communities Jewish communities being taken out of their homes in the villages throughout Europe and going on the trains. And they sat and said nothing and did nothing. Now, we can't judge, but you make a choice to be a bystander. It's not something that happens. You actually make a choice whether you do something or don't do something. And then we see the rescuers. The rescuers were sometimes from the Nazi Party. Some of those people who had compassion, even though they were Nazi Party members, helped Jews. There were soldiers, clergy. There were ordinary people, Christians and non-Christians. The most famous would be Schindler, but there are many others. Now, do the clergy and does Christianity play a part in the Holocaust? Well, yes, it does. My studies at Yad Vashem allowed me to look at the archives in Yad Vashem with regard to the Holocaust, and I found a number of reports that involved clergy. One of those was written on the 12th of August 1941, written about the killings of Jews in the Pripyat marshes of the Ukraine. And the report says this: the driving of women and children into the marshes did not have the expected success because the marshes were not so deep that one could sink. After a depth of about 1 meter, there was in most cases solid ground, probably sand, preventing complete sinking. The Ukrainian clergy were very cooperative and made themselves available for every action. And an action means a period of time during which Jews are murdered. So we know that the Ukrainian clergy were helping and were present at those murders. Some of you may or may not have heard of a concentration camp or a murder camp called Jasenovac, which is in Croatia, where 700,000 Jews were murdered. Also, gypsies, homosexuals and Serbs were murdered there. But the leader of that camp was Miroslav Filipic. He was a Franciscan friar. As a Croatian extreme nationalist and a fascist, this friar became known as the murderer of the century because of the violent way in which he murdered Jews. In a book called The Magnum Crimen, written by Victor Novak, we see a description of Tomislav Filipic entering a classroom with 12 of his Ustaša, and Ustaša means army, Croatian army. And it says that he ordered the teacher to bring a Serb child to the front of the class. He then murdered the child by slitting the child's throat. Then he addressed the Eustacia and he says, by this, in the name of God, I baptize these degenerates, speaking about the children, and you should follow my example. I am the first to accept all sin into my soul, and I will confess you and absolve you of all sin. And then he carried on and killed the remaining children in that class. And in one day, in that town, 2,730 Serbs were murdered and 500 children under his command. There is no doubt that the Catholic Church were aware of the actions by Thomas Filipak and at Jezanovic, because there are records that show that Catholic clergy visited that death camp. And one of the things that we see in the death camp is that the murders weren't by gas, they were by stabbing. And many of the actions, and I've explained the actions as a period of killing of Jews, many of those took place in churches in Croatia and were perpetrated alongside Christian communities. So we can see that the Holocaust is a Christian event. Now today, churches are supporting Israel, getting alongside Israel, but there are some churches and Christian organizations that are vilifying Israel and calling for boycotts today. There are many in the church who are doing nothing. Many aren't even praying for Israel. And as I finish this, I ask you, when you turn off the television, would you please pray for the Jewish people and pray for Israel? Thank you.